love to ask me where I come from. And when I answer that I'm from South Africa, the follow-up question is usually, but where are your parents from? And when I say that they too are from South Africa, they ask, but where are your grandparents from? And I say, well, they were also born in South Africa. And so we travel back in time. Inevitably, we get to 1860, where they want to know where my great-great-great-grandparents came from. And so I say to them, well, yes, they were from India. And in that moment, the clouds part, and the music swells, and a ray of light descends from the heavens and hits their face. India. I knew it. I knew that you were Indian. Well, congratulations. After Sciences Po, I think you have a long career at the CIA waiting for you. Now, South Africa is famous for many things. The world's first heart transplant, the cradle of humankind, how we've successfully turned corruption into an art form. But what you may not know is that South Africa is home to the largest Indian population outside of India. How did we get there? Well, the answer to that is the indentured labor system. Indentured labor is just a more palatable term for slavery. 150 years ago, the British brought Indians to South Africa to work on the sugarcane plantations. 20% of the people who got on those boats didn't arrive. Those who did were promised wages, land, and return passage. They were given none of these things. And that was just the beginning of their troubles. At the turn of the century, the government began formalizing a system of laws that would infamously become known as apartheid. These laws were meticulously designed to create borders within borders within borders. For my great-grandparents' generation, this meant forced removal from their homes and relocation into Indian townships. At the time, 90% of South Africa's citizens were confined to 10% of its land. People of color needed a passport to go to work every day, and only during daylight hours. If you missed your bus, if your employer kept you late, you were fined, beaten, forcibly detained. At the time, my great-grandparents had transitioned from indentured labor into trade. My great-grandfather owned a record store in downtown Johannesburg. One of his regular clients was an aspiring lawyer, a boxer, and a great lover of jazz who you may know as Nelson Mandela. I like to think that my great-grandmother and Nelson Mandela would have been good friends. But the reality is that my great-grandmother didn't like black people. She certainly hated white people. In fact, she was quite suspicious of Indian people. I don't think she even liked my great-grandfather that much, to be honest. The apartheid system was as complex as it was absurd. Initially, the government divided us into two: Europeans, who were white, and non-Europeans, everyone else. And this was plastered all over the country, signs everywhere, buses, benches, bathrooms. But it was problematic. It created a lot of confusion. You had American tourists coming to South Africa and proudly standing in front of the non-European sign. American tourists, fiercely patriotic, easily confused by signs. And so they had to change it from European and non-European to new classifications: native, which was black, white, colored, Indian. Now this is where it gets really absurd. Koreans and Japanese were classified as honorary whites because of our political ties. But the Chinese lived amongst the Indians. Filipinos were deemed black. If you were, how would you say, racially ambiguous, you were subject to the pencil test. What is the pencil test, you ask? Take a pencil, stick it in your hair, shake your head. If the pencil falls out, boom, 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 congratulations, you're white. If the pencil stays in, you're black. Look around the room at the people sitting next to you. How many of you would have arbitrarily failed or passed the pencil test just if you were having a bad hair day? Look around the room again and remember that these laws were designed by an educated elite at the time. For my grandparents' generation, their biggest struggle was the apartheid education system. My grandparents were amongst the first Indians in South Africa to get their tertiary education and to get their degrees, but the conditions were abysmal. They had to take a train to class every day for hours and hours. The Indian university was actually not even in the country. It was off the coast on a former prison. By the time my parents were in high school in 1976, there was a massive uprising of about 20,000 students to protest this education system. The police opened fire, killing 176 of them. At the time, the architect of apartheid, whose name was Hendrik Verwoerd, said, "There is no place for the black in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching a black child mathematics when he cannot use it in practice?" I keep this in my pocket because I refuse to learn that quote. Hendrik Verwoerd, architect of apartheid, didn't think us dark-skinned people could remember numbers very well. But there is one number that I remember perfectly. 06, 09, 1966. That, Mr. Verwoerd, wherever you are, was the day that you were assassinated. Ironically, both of my parents went on to become maths teachers. Those Soweto uprisings led to the United Nations putting sanctions on South Africa. But a lot of the developed world turned a blind eye. And it was only 9 years later, in 1985, that South Africa was properly boycotted. 1985 was 2 years before I was born. But in reality, apartheid was only legally dismantled in 1994. 1994, ladies and gentlemen, was not a long time ago. 22 years. To give you some perspective, almost everybody in this room was already born. Clinton had been president for a year. The Lion King was about to be released. We had already cloned animals. Justin Bieber was 1 month old. And racial segregation was systematically alive in an entire country. 22 years. Now, I'm not saying that Justin Bieber is to blame for racial segregation, but have we considered it? We should. Growing up in the tail end of apartheid, I never really questioned why my classmates and my teachers had the same skin color that I did. I never really questioned why there were certain bathrooms or places that we weren't allowed to go to. I always assumed that white people did something completely different in the bathroom. For years, I have been following them into those bathrooms, and I still have no concrete answers. But in 1996, my parents sent me from an Indian school to a white school. And at 8 years old, that was my first brush with multiculturalism. Now I was in a room with people who looked different to me, who acted differently to me, who spoke differently to me. And not only that, these people came from a culture that I had been taught was superior to my own. So what does a young person do? Do you emulate them? Do you try and speak like them? Do you try and act like them? I certainly did. That changed as I got older. Once I asked my great-grandmother for advice. I said, "I'm in a white school now. Should I act more like a white?" She looked at me horrified. She said, "Like a white? They're so fragile. They have allergies. You can't even leave them out in the sun for more than an hour." But these are questions that we ask in South Africa today. As a South African Indian, can I claim African culture as my own? can I claim Africa as my homeland? The short answer is no. First of all, there is no such thing as African culture. Every time I hear the words, the situation in Africa at Sciences Po, Robert Mugabe lives for another 10 years. Please don't ever use that term again. But even in South Africa, we speak 11 official languages. We have a multitude of ethnicities and cultures within one country. Something that our government saw as black. The narrative of South African Indians, then, is one of a borderless generation. We can't claim South Africa as our own, but there is no ancestral homeland for us to go back to. There is no India waiting for us. Unsurprisingly, colonizers were not very good at keeping records. Our names, our birth dates, all lost. This is true for many children of immigrants around the world. We move between identities from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour. This is true for a lot of you sitting here today. The borders between race and nationality and ethnicity and gender and sexuality and religion are more blurred than ever before. What do we do? So like I said, people like to ask me where I'm from. And in my heart, I'll always say South Africa. But you should know that I'm South African Indian. One who's lived in Canada and Australia, who's worked in South Korea, who's studied in France, who has friends from Romania to Vietnam to Brazil. Complexity is a new form of existence, and it's exciting, and it is terrifying. These borders that we put up, people are fighting wars over them, and so we have to respect them as being real. We have to respect the borders that live in the hearts and minds of others. But today I ask you, I implore you to strive for complexity. Sciences Po.